So I finally got around to watching the Iron Claw movie, and for a large part of the film, I was in tears. It's an emotional experience no matter who you are. But I think these sort of movies hit different for wrestling fans. I think this is because the Von Erichs are a tragedy from our community. I also think it adds to the relatability aspect for wrestling fans, as most of us have dreamed of being a wrestling superstar or a world champion at some point in our lives. So to see the tragedy that has come with that endeavor definitely hits different for a wrestling fan. For those who've never been on this channel before, I am Sarcastic Mark. I cover wrestling history going back as far as ancient times, and today we're going to talk about the patriarch of the Von Erich family, Fritz Von Erich. I'm going to do my best to not dwell too much on the tragic aspects of the Von Erichs through this series. It's very hard to tell these guys' stories without bringing up all the tragedy that came with their lives. However, I think the movie itself did enough to cover those tragedies. We're here to talk about their wrestling careers, so hopefully this won't be too much of an emotionally heavy one. Fritz Von Erich was born Jack Barton Adkisson on August 16th, 1929. He would change his name to Fritz Von Erich during his wrestling career in order to portray a character that was fond of a certain Austrian painter. Growing up in Texas, Fritz would attend Crozier Tech High School in Dallas before heading to Southern Methodist University, where he showed athletic talent in discus and football. By all accounts, Fritz didn't have the easiest childhood, with his father strongly encouraging him to be tough.
Yeah, my dad was just a big kid, big for his age, you know. It's too bad. People always consider that freaky big kid that he's strong when he's really not. He's a little kid, he's soft, but he takes it because he doesn't want to be called a sissy. My granddad had him boxing out in the streets of Jewett, punching, another kid. I think it was Baron X. He had really did my dad hard, but maybe it was to raise him into the iron that he was.
This is very much a foreshadowing of the type of man Fritz was to become. He would continue his college education and football career at Corpus Christi before signing with the Dallas Texans of the now-defunct American Football League. Unfortunately, football was not going to work out for our boy Fritz. He was cut from the team before ever playing a game for them. He worked briefly as a firefighter and attempted to make his way into the Canadian Football League. It was during this time, whilst Fritz was in Edmonton, that he would meet another famous wrestling family's patriarch, Stu Hart. This in itself is quite interesting from the perspective of a wrestling historian. Here we have two men who would go on to found huge wrestling families, both of which would reach the zenith of the industry, both of which would be torn to breaking point by tragedy. At the time, Stu was running Klondike Wrestling, which would later become Stampede Wrestling. Stu Hart saw potential in the 6'4", 280-pound Jack Adkisson. Stu would give him the name of Fritz Von Erich and would have him team with Walter Sieber, who would become his kayfabe brother under the name Waldo Von Erich. The reason for this gimmick, that was inspired by supporters of a famous dog lover, was to capitalize on the post-war sentiment in the United States and Canada. Pretty much ever since that war, in all forms of entertainment, the idea of a bad guy who was a massive fan of that fella with the moustache became an archetypal villain in all forms of entertainment. But at that time in the 50s and 60s, that sort of character was extremely popular within the world of wrestling. Wrestling in this era would see Fritz take on the likes of Bobo Brazil, Ricky Starr, and Giant Baba, among others. Fritz stood out with his menacing voice and was a lot larger than most wrestlers during that era. He also had big hands, which inspired his finishing move, the Iron Claw. This run was not without tragedy. In 1959, the oldest son of Fritz tragically passed away in a horrific accident, which indirectly led to Fritz's split from his kayfabe brother. Fritz and his family had briefly been living in New York, whilst Fritz was working the East Coast territories. However, this tragic passing led to him leaving the East Coast, and in general he was more limited in how much he would travel from there on out. When he left New York, it's reported by many who knew him or the family that the intention was for Fritz to potentially retire from wrestling.
Fritz Von Erich was a huge star, especially up in the Northeast and the Buffalo and Toronto area, but all across the country in the 1950s. He decides he's going to get off the road. His oldest son, Jackie, had already been electrocuted in that trailer park that they were living in up in the Buffalo territory, and he decided he was going to get off the road, take his wife Doris and his sons, and they were going to move back to Texas. And he was actually going to move to Corpus Christi and open up like a fishing and boating and bait thing or whatever and raise his family.
However, he took a couple of bookings in Dallas for Ed McLemore and ended up doing very well. In the 60s, he would win the AWA World title a couple of times and would make his way to Sam Muchnick's NWA territory in St. Louis, continuing to portray his German heel character. It was during this run in the 60s that Fritz would become embroiled in a feud with Gene Kiniski. Of course, for a shoot, they were good friends, but in kayfabe, these two wanted to tear each other apart. This was a heel versus heel feud at the time and was probably part of Fritz Von Erich reinventing himself, letting go of his previous gimmick in favor of a more all-American character, so as to endear himself to the people of Dallas, Texas, where Fritz would become a huge draw, working for Ed McLemore and Maurice Siegel. Despite wrestling's kayfabe nature, people were more forgiving of gimmick changes than you'd think.
That was a little more than 10 years after he'd been a big-time SMU football player. And so they kind of knew anyway, slowly, like, Austin, the people started getting behind him. He kept the name Fritz Von Erich, and just all of a sudden, he didn't do the Nazi thing. He didn't do anything German. He just called himself Fritz Von Erich, but he talked normally and became the toughest man in the state of Texas in the eyes of the wrestling fans.
Whilst working for Ed and Morris, Fritz basically staged a coup on the Texas territory. I want to explore the ins and outs of this in a separate video, as this is intended as a broad summary. But to cut a long story short, in 1969, Fritz Von Erich owned the promotion following Ed McLemore's passing.
He also took the booking office. It went from the Houston booking office to the Dallas booking office.
That's right. They used to book all the Texas talent except for the Amarillo territory, which the Funks had, control over. All the talent in Texas, the San Antonio territory, or what would become the San Antonio territory, with Joe Blanchard as the local promoter, Dallas, Houston, they all used the same talent. And then when Fritz took Dallas over, like you said, the booking office went to Dallas, and he was booking all the talent, and that's when things started going. He wouldn't really retire, but the people knew he was never going to win the title by that point because he was getting too old and it just wasn't happening.
Through the 70s, Fritz's sons would start to wrestle for the promotion, and Fritz would take a back seat, making fewer in-ring appearances and concentrating on his efforts as a promoter. He also, for a time in the 70s, was NWA president. He wrestled his first retirement match against King Kong Bundy in 1982. During this time, Fritz was revolutionizing World Class into a promotion which could be compared against the powerhouses that were to come in the 90s. The innovations of World Class during this time included having multiple cameras surrounding the ring, allowing cameramen to jump on the ring apron for better shots, as well as shooting vignettes and promos away from the Sportatorium, which was the home venue for World Class. They would also mic up the ring, which was a novel technique that World Class was using. Fritz was old school and was worried that multiple camera angles and this new mic the ring technique would expose the business, since the audience may be able to hear wrestlers calling spots. But of course, we know now that even if fans do catch the odd call, it's worth it. Other promotions quickly followed suit, but World Class was revolutionizing the business during the early 80s. With high production value, selling out huge venues, entrance music, and syndicated television leading to the Dallas territory keeping hold of the Texas market through most of the 80s. Fritz either realized the star power of his sons, or was vicariously living through them, depending on who you ask. It's most likely that it was a mix of both when you look at the first adult Von Erich to pass away, David Von Erich. It's easy to see how much of a star he could have been. During this time, Gary Hart was booking for Fritz, and the top feud of the time was the Von Erich boys taking on the Freebirds. The NWA was paying close attention to Fritz's promotion, sending the world title holder for matches at various points, most of which would end with some sort of screwed finish. This would keep the Von Erich boys over as stars, as well as keep the belt in the hands of NWA's chosen champion. Business was good for World Class. They sold out the Reunion Arena 3 times, turning away thousands of fans at the gate, and made like 200 grand each time. Whipping out the inflation calculator tells me that's over 600K in today's money. They were breaking state records repeatedly. It's no secret how many tragedies the family went through at this time. To summarize it, he lost most of his sons through various tragic deaths, which I will explore in their individual documentaries. It's just too much to go into here. I mean, they couldn't even cover all of it in the Iron Claw movie, having to trim some of the tragedy because there was just too much. Unfortunately, Fritz had in large part built his promotion around his sons, and by the late 1980s, the audience was running low on patience and sympathy, given how many tragedies the Von Erichs had been through, and also in part due to the response to these tragedies by Fritz. The Sons of Fritz had begun to no-show events, which led to sponsors dropping out. This was taking an axe to the promotion's revenue. He would hold memorial shows, which made sense. However, Dave Meltzer would in large part attribute some of the blame for these tragedies onto Fritz. It was Dave's opinion that Fritz had converted to Christianity as part of a sleazy ploy to win his wife back over and reimagine his family's public image as all-American good boy babyface. Dave also cited how Fritz was in denial regarding his son's substance abuse issues. Allegedly, any time the Von Erich boys would get in trouble with the police, Fritz would blame the cops. Dave paints a picture of contrast between the world that Fritz and his sons had portrayed versus the grim reality of their situation. An illusion that for many was shattered when Fritz did angles such as a fake heart attack angle and multiple memorial shows. The fake heart attack angle deserves a video of its own. It's a moment in world-class championship wrestling history that is now remembered as the infamous Christmas Day massacre. The general mood was shifting to the idea that the Von Erichs were exploiting their own tragedies for monetary gain. Of course, Fritz could hold on to his public image for quite a while given his implied power with local media and politicians. A lot of people say Fritz Von Erich was the most powerful man in Dallas at the time. A lot of the politicians and journalists were fans of wrestling and helped him cover up many of his son's trespasses against the law. By the time his final son passed away, Fritz had already merged his promotion with Jerry Jarrett's Continental Wrestling Association, as the WCCW dream had lost its goodwill and multiple top stars in tragedy. Following his divorce from Doris Von Erich in 1992, a son of Fritz who was arguably their biggest star, Kerry Von Erich was the last in a long list of tragedies that had taken place during Fritz's life, and he no longer had Doris either. It's genuinely one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever had to write about, even if many people see it as largely down to his own actions. Fritz's surviving son, Kevin Von Erich, still speaks very highly of him, whether this is to protect the family legacy or out of genuine love for his father, or whether the bad stories about Fritz are overblown is up to you. But Marshall Von Erich, who is Kevin's son, expresses having great memories of his grandpa Fritz from childhood, saying, quote, "We just saw him as a jolly good time, fun grandpa." So it's a mixed bag. I personally think it's hard to judge Fritz by modern standards. A lot of men from that era were hardened and emotionally perhaps not the most well-rounded. They had seen a completely different side to the world and reacted accordingly, and sometimes, just like us, they got it wrong. I do, however, in reading more about Fritz, see my opinion sliding more negative rather than more positive. At first I thought he was the devil because of his portrayal in the movie. Then I read more and thought he was just a naive father pushing his sons towards a never-forgotten dream. Now, as I've read even more, it's definitely that he was both, and also somewhere in between. So what do you think? There's more to come on this channel about the Von Erichs. I figured the best place to start was Fritz. Obviously there's multiple stories that have come up in this video that I'll have to go in more depth about in individual videos. Perhaps that ends up with an Ultimate Von Erich video where I compile them all together. Until then, I've got work to do. Thanks for watching another Sarcastic Mark upload. I know you guys love the history as much as I do, so feel free to like and subscribe to support the channel. See you next time.